Well, each Sunday during this season of Lent, we're going to be taking a look at a different conversation that Jesus has with a person or people in the Gospel of John. And the two conversations now, last week was Nicodemus, today is with a woman from Samaria. They couldn't be more different. Nicodemus was a Pharisee, which usually we think of Pharisees as being mostly legalistic. Probably they weren't all that way, but many of them were very legalistic, very strict religion. Whereas the Samaritan woman was considered to be, by the Jews anyway, non-religious, not religious at all. And so you have these complete polar opposites. Now, in verse 4, it says that Jesus traveled on foot and that he had to go through Samaria. He didn't actually have to go through Samaria. He could have gone around it. I wonder if the author is meaning that this was a God-appointed journey, that Jesus was doing this on purpose to come across this woman, and so therefore he had to go through Samaria. But most Jews who were traveling went around Samaria. They didn't go in or through Samaria. They did not associate with one another, Jews and Samaritans. They had a long history of animosity towards one another, going back to the Old Testament days during the exile. When the Babylonians ransacked the Holy Land, and those that were killed were taken to live in the foreign land of Babylon, there were a few people, the poorest of the poor, that were kept in the Holy Land to take care of it. These people eventually mixed their religion with the neighbors, and so that by the time those in Babylon returned to rebuild Jerusalem, they considered them to be apostate, which means they have turned away from the faith, and we don't want anything to do with them because they have abandoned the faith, which is kind of ironic since they did the same thing in their history. But anyway, they abandoned their faith, and so those Samaritans, we want nothing to do with them. They are a part of the enemy. And so for hundreds of years, they hadn't really associated with one another. And so we have this interesting dynamic, this bad dynamic really, where people would rather go around Samaria than go through it, even if going around it was a longer route. Well, Jesus goes through Samaria, and when he gets to the well, he rests and he's thirsty. This is the 6th hour of the day, and it's getting kind of hot. And this is when this woman comes to get some water from the well. Now, oftentimes, women would come to get water in groups, oftentimes in the morning, because it was not as hot then. And which leads us to believe that this woman was probably an outcast in her own society. Well, she comes to the well, and Jesus has the audacity to ask for water, which sounds really simple to us, but again, these people just don't talk to each other. And so the woman is pretty surprised that he would ask for water. And so she says, well, Jews, we don't talk to you. You don't talk to us. What do you do? You're asking me for water. And he says, well, if you knew who I was, you'd be asking me for water. And he talks about the living water, that when you drink it, you will never thirst again. And in fact, it will bubble up into eternal life. Well, this woman is excited. You know, in a world where you have to go and fetch your own water, this would be amazing. And so she thinks Jesus is still talking about water. Jesus isn't talking about water anymore. Usually Jesus isn't talking about what we think he's talking about. And that's the case. It was true with Nicodemus, and it's the same with this woman from Samaria. He's not talking about water anymore. She doesn't realize it. And so he says, go get your husband, or, you know, which is kind of interesting. What does that have to do with anything? But he asks for her husband. She says, well, I don't have a husband. And he says, you're right, you don't. You've had 5 husbands. The person you're with is not your husband. And, you know, ouch. How many of you know somebody like that? Maybe you know somebody who's had an interesting past, maybe in the community, maybe somebody you know. And how many of you think to yourself, they're never going to learn? You know, they keep making the same mistake again. They're never going to learn. And you might not ever vocalize that. You might not, but you have thoughts of judgment. And you have thoughts of condemnation. They're never going to learn. They're hopeless. Well, the interesting thing here is that Jesus didn't bring this up to condemn her or to even talk about it. He didn't bring it up to correct her, to change her behavior, to try to get her on the straight and narrow. He did it for a goal that he had, and that was to get her to see who he was. And so when she realizes he knows a lot about her, she figures that he must be a prophet. And so, okay, I got a question I need to ask you. You know, she has this question she has to ask this prophet. And she says, now, the Jews have always said we need to worship in Jerusalem, but we like to worship in our area in this mountain. Now, which one is it? Who's right, the Jews or the Samaritans? Okay, this is a hotly debated issue of that day. And so she wants to take advantage of this opportunity. Here's a special person who can give us the answer finally and can settle this thing. And Jesus doesn't answer the way she wanted or expected. He doesn't say Jerusalem or the mountain. He does say the Jews worship what they know and that the Samaritans worship what they don't know, but he doesn't really answer the question as far as where should they worship. And he says instead that the time is coming when people will worship him in spirit and truth. So the idea is that the location isn't as important as how we worship, whether we're actually worshiping or just going through the motions of worshiping. And so he gets above the level of debate, and he helps her to think in a bigger context than what she's currently thinking. And so then she says, well, I know the Messiah is coming, and when he comes, he is going to tell us a lot of things. He's going to reveal a lot of things to us. You see, evidently the Samaritans, even though they weren't Jewish per se, they still had a lot of the Jewish teachings and influence, and they must have been expecting a Messiah. And so this is when Jesus has the perfect opportunity, and he says, well, that's me, basically. I'm the Messiah. And she is amazed, and so she goes back into town, and she tells everybody, come and see this person who knows everything I ever did. And so some people from town come out to see Jesus, and indeed they are impressed as well, and so they believe, and they invite Jesus to stay for 2 more days, and he accepts the invitation. Now this is quite the conversation and quite the response from this woman. Wow. I mean, last week Nicodemus, we don't hear his response to the conversation. It just kind of flows into a monologue. We never hear what Nicodemus has to say after that. Although we do hear that Nicodemus became a secret follower of Jesus. But with this Samaritan woman, her response is quick and it is strong. She becomes an evangelist, and she literally leads people to Christ. And the other interesting thing about this conversation is that Jesus is not really helping himself by going to Samaria and staying there for 2 days. When Jesus gave his first sermon at the beginning of his ministry, right after he was tempted in the wilderness, when he gave his first sermon, it was in his hometown. And he read from Isaiah, and then he said, this scripture has been revealed in your hearing. The interesting thing about the Isaiah text is that when he quotes it, and I'm not going to read the whole thing here from memory, but I have come to release the captives, to set the prisoners free, you know, all that. But he stops short of the sentence in Isaiah where it talks about the vengeance of the Lord. And that's interesting, because most Jewish people who knew their Hebrew scriptures would know that that last part in Isaiah about the vengeance of the Lord goes right with it. And it also flows along with a lot of the prophets in the Old Testament that say that not only in the day of the Lord at the end will Israel be back and be better than ever, but the other nations will be judged, right? The other nations will be judged, and basically they're going to get what they deserve. They may be messing with you now, but they're going to get what they deserve, and you're going to be on top. And so in Isaiah says that he came to release the captives, to set prisoners free, and then to the vengeance of the Lord. Jesus stops short of saying the vengeance of the Lord. He just stops with the good stuff, and then he says, this has been revealed in your hearing. And he continues on in conversation saying that salvation is for all people. Not in the universal sense that everybody is necessarily going to accept salvation, but in the sense that salvation is open to all people, not just Jews, but all people. People didn't like that. They kicked him out of his hometown because they didn't like that. They didn't like him taking away that vengeance part. And so that he already is not received well, and then he goes into Samaria, this place you're not supposed to go, and he talks to this woman who is hopeless, and then he stays for 2 days at their invitation. This is not going to help his reputation with the Jewish people. But you see, Jesus is not interested in their views of people who are different from them. He's not interested in their xenophobia. He's not interested in dealing with that. You know, in the Bible there are many stories that are sympathetic to the outsider and the enemy. We have Rahab the prostitute. We have Naaman, the commander of the army of Syria. We have Jonah, who's preaching to the Ninevites to repent. The Ninevites were terribly mean to the Jewish people. And so we have these stories that are focused on trying to help people to show sympathy towards the enemy. Usually when we want to fight an enemy, we try to view them all as being something other than human. And, you know, a story that's sympathetic towards somebody from the enemy is meant to be provocative. And this is what Jesus is doing too. He's going outside the bounds of what many people think he should, and he is reaching out to people that others have counted as worthless. And this is going to upset people, and indeed it does. Eventually, it's part of one of the many variables that leads to his crucifixion. So a few things that we can get from this conversation. Number one, nobody is hopeless, and anybody can be used by God. It doesn't matter what they've done in the past. It doesn't matter how immoral they were or are. You know, he brought up this lady's past and present, we should say, because she was still living in this situation. And as I said, he didn't do it to condemn her. He didn't do it to change her at that point, but he did it for a different purpose. Jesus wanted to use her to become an evangelist to her own area. And he knew that she had potential. So that's number one. Sometimes we view other people as hopeless, and we think that they'll never learn. God can't, you know, we wouldn't say that. We wouldn't say God can't use them. But that's implied. But the thing is, God can use anyone. And the same goes for if you are the one that you think is hopeless. Let's say maybe that's internalized to yourself, and you have these negative thoughts towards yourself and judgmental thoughts, and you think that you are hopeless because you have done something wrong or are doing something wrong, and you say, I'll never learn. I'll never learn. Well, remember the Samaritan woman. Jesus did not think she was hopeless, and the same is true for anyone, including yourself. So that's number one. Number two, we have to remember that, you know, sometimes we get too excited about changing people's behavior. And that's the first thing we try to do, is we try to change someone's behavior. Jesus was not concerned with changing this woman's behavior yet. You know, maybe he thought that would come down the road, I don't know, but that was not his concern at this point. At this point, he wanted her to see who he was and to have her life changed. And you see, Jesus understood that somebody is probably more likely to modify their behavior after their lives are transformed than before. And so his first thing was to introduce her to him and to help her to see that this time had come of God's rule. And so oftentimes we want to change people's behavior. We're taught sometimes that when we want to witness to people or we want to tell other people about Jesus, that we got to start with the bad news before we give them the good news. We need to tell them that they're sinners. We need to convince them that they're sinners. Whether we bring up the 10 Commandments or whether we, whatever it is, we need to make sure they realize that they are hopeless first before we give them the good news. And all that's true, right? That's all true, but where do we get the idea that we always have to start with that when we're sharing with people about Jesus? Jesus never did that. In the Gospels, I don't see a point, you could maybe find a point and correct me, but I haven't seen a point in the Gospels where Jesus starts off by telling somebody how bad they are before he tells them about the love of God. Now that doesn't mean that there isn't a point, like I said, that doesn't mean that there isn't a place for confronting sin or telling somebody that there's this part in their life that they really need to work on or change. There is definitely a time for that, but I'm not sure it's before they know Jesus. Jesus never did that. He never pointed out people's sin before talking about the love of God. whether it's Matthew the tax collector or now this woman from Samaria. Technically, he did point out some sin, but he didn't do it for that purpose that we usually think of. No, usually he wants people to experience the life-giving message of God first. And so that's something that we want to keep in mind. We don't have to convince people that they're horrible before we give them the good news. We can start with the good news, and we can help them to experience the life-transforming power of Jesus Christ before we get into all those other things. So that's number 2. And then number 3 is that, we debate about a lot of things in life. A lot of things. Some things that we debate are important. Some things that we debate about are not very important. But, this Samaritan woman, when she found out Jesus was a prophet, oh boy, here's my chance to get the answer to this question. Have you ever had a time when you wondered, what would you ask Jesus if you had a sit-down meeting with him and you could ask him one thing? What would you ask him? What is it that you would want to get a straight answer to? We could think of a number of things, probably, that we would ask. Some things are pretty important. Some things are maybe not as important. And how would Jesus answer? It's hard to say. That's why we want to ask him. But it's hard to say how Jesus would answer. We know that sometimes Jesus doesn't answer in the way that we hope. Is it A or B? Usually he doesn't answer with those questions. Sometimes Jesus answers with a question. Oftentimes in the Bible we see Jesus answers a question with another question that's meant to get someone thinking beyond the boundaries of where they were currently thinking, to try to rise above the level of debate, as he did with the woman from Samaria. And so it could be that Jesus would do that. We don't know. But as we think about our debates, some things are less important. Maybe it's a sibling rivalry, or maybe it's a question of, who's right? Do we baptize by sprinkling, or do we need to immerse them? Depending on where you are, you might think that's more important than someone else would. But some things are smaller, and then some things are larger. Like, how do we protect our kids in schools? That's the big debate today that's going on. How do we keep our kids safe? And so, whatever the debate is, the question is, how do we debate and how do we argue while showing respect for those who disagree with us? In other words, how do we rise above the level of name-calling or shaming or judging others or questioning their intelligence? It's so tempting to do. We see it everywhere. It modeled for us on TV, and you see it. It's so easy to do and to fall into that. So how do we rise above that level of debate as Jesus did? Well, I don't think it means that if you're going to show everyone respect, it means you can't argue your case. I think you can. I think you can argue passionately for what you believe in. For instance, if you believe that gun control is the best way to protect children in the future, I think you can argue with passion and still respect the other person. And if you believe that gun control is not really going to make any difference and that we need to focus on other things to keep our kids safe, I think you can argue that too with passion, and you can do so while showing respect to those who disagree with you. What so often happens is that we get to treating those who disagree with us as though they are less intelligent. We start to label them, we start to stereotype them, and we may even think that they are evil. And so this is not helpful. It creates enemies rather than building bridges. It doesn't move us as a community forward. Instead, it just divides. This is what happened with the Jews and the Samaritans. They were divided because they saw one another. Usually in these cases, it's both sides are partially at fault, but they saw one another as enemies, and so they could not have anything to do with one another anymore. And that happens so often. But oftentimes in a debate, not always, but oftentimes in a debate, we can find that we have common goals when we get down to it. For instance, no matter what you think the method is, most everyone agrees that we want our kids safe. And most everyone agrees that we want to try to prevent these things from happening again, or that if they do happen, that they're not so terrible, that we can maybe decrease the casualties or the horror of it. And so we can all agree on that, even if we don't agree on the method. And maybe we can come to a compromise. You know, compromise is something that anymore, you know, compromise used to be a positive word. And now compromise is usually always seen negatively. That if you've compromised, you just weren't strong enough. If you've compromised, then you lost. But really, compromise is a way, and of course when we talk about some of our bedrock beliefs about God, you know, we don't necessarily want to compromise on those, but with most things, compromise means that both people can work together to move forward. And so maybe the solution to the things we debate about can include some things from one group and some things from another, and we can put them together, and maybe we can work so that both people feel that their concerns are met. You know, sometimes that's possible, sometimes it's not. But regardless of the situation, in this conversation with the woman from Samaria, Jesus teaches that the best way to handle debates is to try to rise above that level of creating enemies and try to work together towards a solution. And to realize, to think bigger, to always try to think bigger than we currently are. It's hard to do sometimes. So, in our living, may we remember these three things. Nobody is hopeless. We don't have to focus so much on changing people. And then finally, the last thing is that in our debates and arguments, that we may rise above the level of calling names or stereotyping or giving evil intentions to people, and instead we can focus on a way forward together. In so doing, we can continue to share the love of God.